Welcome back to Sam Goes on Record. After introducing you to two of my favorite sets of records from my collection, I thought we would expand our scope a little bit to movies. Apart from being a record collector, and especially a collector of soundtracks, of course I'm also a big movie buff. And today, instead of presenting you with 10 favorite movies of mine, I thought I'd go into a different direction. Do you also have guilty pleasure movies? I do for sure. It's those kind of movies that you can always watch again and again and you have done so many times, but at the same time you know that they're not really great movies. That some people even think they're horrible. And still you enjoy watching them every time. So I selected 10 guilty pleasure movies from my collection. Number 10, Fuck You Goethe, a German comedy from 2013. I was convinced I would hate this movie because everybody kept talking about it, how funny it was, and I hated the concept of yet another school comedy movie with a raucous teacher and with unruly students. And me, of course, as a teacher, I was kind of prejudiced against such school comedies because they're often shallow and weak and not very funny. I was proven wrong. I laughed myself to tears watching this movie for the first time. And of course, it's Elia Mbarek's take as a teacher, or should we say a criminal cum teacher, that makes this movie really perfect. And all the supporting players in it are great as well. Katja Riemann and Uschi Glas in a small role, and all the student characters as well. And it's one of those comedies that never tires. I was surprised that a comedy like this would really be of my taste, but there it is. Number 9, Top Secret, the 1984 comedy starring Val Kilmer as a rock and roll singer who is invited to play a concert in the GDR, the German Democratic Republic. It turns out to be a disaster because of course the GDR officials, they try to follow him wherever he goes, and he tries to trick them whenever he can, and he gets involved in some kind of crazy spy plot. The producers of this movie had just made Airplane and Airplane 2 before that, and would go on to become very famous thanks to The Naked Gun and the Hot Shots movies. This is riotous to still watch it, and I recently discovered this DVD in a record shop and I bought it, and I had not been aware how good it still is and how not flat those jokes are in this movie. Number 8, I've been in love with Piranha since I saw it at the Locarno Film Festival in 1999. Back then they were showing movies by director Joe Dante, who was also famous for his Gremlins movies. But one of his 1970s hits that was kind of copying the success of Jaws a few years earlier was Piranha. As you can already tell, it's the river version of Jaws, with a number of people who are threatened by a swarm of piranhas who have been released from a chemical plant up in the mountains, and then there's a race for time to try to avoid a disaster, and there's lots of teenagers and tourists in the water and some horribly splattery scenes involved. And Joe Dante does a great job because it's at the same time really ironic, and it's a small critique as well of the 1970s American military and political complex, and if you can tell, he spurs his movie with a lot of those references. At the same time, there's also great music by one of my favorite composers, Pino Donaggio, which makes for an eerie, suspenseful atmosphere, and some of the movie is really good. It's funny and it's well made, and it's a cult classic in my opinion. Number 7, Brother Sun and Sister Moon. I already presented the soundtrack by Riz Ortolani for this movie. It's a 1971 production by Franco Zeffirelli, starring Graham Faulkner. It's the story of Francesco de Assisi, an Italian spiritualist who decides to leave his wealth behind to become poor in the countryside. The movie that Zeffirelli did, together with the music by Donovan for the songs and Ortolani for the soundtrack, is a marvel. Both in terms of its pictures and also the spiritual journey that Assisi goes through. And the images combined with the music, the landscape, and just the style of Zeffirelli being able to capture both the beauty of faces and the beauty of their surroundings is amazing. And I think together with the movie adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, this is one of his greatest movies, but it's also one of the rare and underrated ones. Number 6, one of the great 1970s horror classics. I love this movie from the start. And of course it's also because of the soundtrack by Jerry Goldsmith. The story is about the American ambassador to the UK and his son and his wife who go to London, and then it turns out that his son is actually the son of the devil. There has been a switch up at the beginning of the movie. And what follows is just a tour de force of horror movie scenes. Some of them have become great classics. Number 5, the Naked Gun trilogy. I would argue that these are also among the most underestimated comedies of all time. And I love watching them over and over again, especially part 1 and part 2 and a half. Leslie Nielsen as Frank Drebin, a police lieutenant who just does everything wrong you can imagine, is just a hoot. It's so well written, it's so ironic, it's so all over the top, especially the relationship to Priscilla Presley, his love interest. And then George Kennedy and O.J. Simpson, who was still an actor at the time and had not become infamous before, is just a lovely combination, and I still enjoy watching this comedy over and over again. Number 4, Towering Inferno. I was a huge fan of disaster movies when I was a teenager already. The airport movies, but the Poseidon Adventure, Earthquake, and especially this one here, Towering Inferno, a 1974 disaster classic starring Steve McQueen and Paul Newman, Faye Dunaway, William Holden, Fred Astaire, and so many more. This movie centers all around the opening night of the highest tower in the world in San Francisco. And on this opening night, unfortunately, because of bad construction, a fire breaks out. And while the fire police chief tries to get all the guests down from the tower, because of course the party is on top of the tower, the owner of the building does not want to leave the party together with his guests. And what ensues is just the most horrifying night of blazing adventure. Together with John Williams' score, this is still a thrill ride, I think. Peppered with great stars from past and present. Faye Dunaway was a huge star at the time, and then Fred Astaire and Jennifer Jones, who were playing late roles in their career. It all comes together for a suspenseful disaster movie that still works on so many levels and still screams out 1970s so much. Number 3. Brian De Palma has often been accused of just copying Hitchcock instead of doing something else. I already presented the soundtrack album for this movie, Obsession, 1976. It's basically a variation of Vertigo, with a guy who loses his wife and daughter, and then later on, after a long period of grief, falls in love with another woman who just looks like his wife. Little does he know what's in store for him, and I'm not going to tell you more about it in case you want to watch it. But I think what Brian De Palma did was not just to do a cheap copy of Vertigo, but he took the same themes and he twisted them and he surprised the audience with yet another twist of the unexpected. Filmed in Florence and New Orleans, this is also a beauty in terms of its images and of course the great late score of Bernard Herrmann, who had also scored Vertigo. So if you want to see a great variation on Hitchcock with its own twists and turns, watch Obsession. Number 2, Somewhere in Time. One of the possibly cheesiest love stories in movie history. And it wasn't a big success when it came out in 1980, starring Christopher Reeve of Superman fame and Jane Seymour, who had been a Bond girl, for instance, in 1973's Live and Let Die. The story is about an author who has an encounter with an old lady who asks him to come back to her. He traces the story of this old lady and discovers that she was a famous actress from the past, and somehow his past is linked to hers. He gets interested in time travel, not being able to forget this lady, and he manages, surprisingly, with the help of a professor and an expert in time travel. And he goes back 100 years, and he meets his love of his life. What follows is both romantic and highly tragic, and I'm again not going to tell you how it turns out, but this is a guilty pleasure of the best kind. You want to be disgusted by its pure romanticism, and after the movie is over, it still haunts you for a long time and you want to see it again. The movie turned into a cult classic and people still go to the hotel where it was filmed, close to Chicago. There's an annual festival there going on when they show the movie and when they meet with members of the cast and crew. Of course, I came across this movie because I had been in love with the John Barry soundtrack for the same movie. And my number one is The Cassandra Crossing. I have to tell a story about how I saw this movie the first time. It was one of those father-son relationship things. It was a late evening and my mom was out for some choir practice, and my dad allowed me to stay up with him and to watch a movie, and it happened to be a movie called Treffpunkt Todesbrücke, The Cassandra Crossing. A disaster movie starring Sophia Loren, Burt Lancaster, Richard Harris, Martin Sheen, O.J. Simpson again, Ava Gardner, and so many more. Let's not forget about Ingrid Thulin. The story is about a train that departs from Geneva, Switzerland, and unaware to its passengers, a terrorist has boarded the train, a terrorist infected with pneumonic plague. And this, of course, in times of Corona, is a very telling and timely movie to watch. What follows is an exciting thrill ride across Europe when an American colonel tries to get rid of the train, and Ingrid Thulin and the passengers try to save the train and the people on it. It's exciting as well for the great score by Jerry Goldsmith, but also of course because I loved sitting beside my dad at the time watching this movie, and it became one of the great cult classics. Only a few years ago it was released by a German label again, Filmjuwelen, and now there's a beautiful version on Blu-ray that's also available on YouTube currently. So these were 10 of my guilty pleasure movies that I can watch over and over again. What are some of your guilty pleasures? Leave them in my comments, and please watch again when Sam goes on record.